that she's not been effective in prosecuting his political targets. Let's get right to our senior political correspondent, Rachel Scott. Rachel, what's the latest here?
Well, the president just announced this on social media just moments ago. I want to read to you what the president is saying as he is announcing that Pam Bondi will no longer serve as Attorney General of the United States. He calls Pam Bondi a great patriot, saying that she has faithfully served as Attorney General over the past year, saying that she has done a tremendous job when it comes to a crackdown in crime. The president says that the administration loves Pam, but that she's going to be moving on to a new job in the private sector. He then adds that the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, will now be serving as the acting Attorney General of the United States. We have been hearing for days now and weeks, quite frankly, that the president and sources within the administration had been frustrated with Attorney General Pam Bondi over her handling of the Epstein files, but also over accusations that she was not going after the president's perceived political opponents hard enough, Diane. Now, when it comes to now Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, who will be serving as the acting Attorney General, just last week he spoke at CPAC, a political conference, and he said to the people who say, why aren't you doing more? I welcome that criticism. Keep putting the pressure on. He's certainly responding to a lot of those accusations and showing that he'd be willing to go a step further, Diane.
Rachel, thank you. And I want to bring in ABC News Chief Washington correspondent John Carl for more on that. John, as Rachel mentioned, sources say the president was frustrated with ineffective prosecutions of his political rivals and also Bondi's handling of the Epstein files. What more are you hearing about why?
Look, in terms of the president himself, he was upset, and he expressed some of this actually publicly, that Bondi hadn't more aggressively tried to prosecute his political enemies, which is really quite a statement, quite a fact when you consider that it was Bondi's Justice Department that brought indictments against James Comey, his former FBI director, and Letitia James, the Attorney General in New York, two of Trump's top political targets. Both those indictments were thrown out, though, and he also, Trump had pushed for an investigation into Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve, and Bondi's Justice Department has opened a criminal investigation that, most people have looked at and said there's nothing there, but nevertheless, they have gone and issued subpoenas to the Fed under Jerome Powell. So she has made quite an effort to carry out his wishes at retribution against his political enemies, but not enough for the president. And in terms of the handling of the Epstein files, this has really been a frustration throughout the administration. Many people in the president's inner circle just unhappy with how she has handled it, thinking that it's been a PR disaster, including her recent testimony on Capitol Hill. So those are the key factors. But here's the thing, Diana, I have to say that if Pam Bondi lost her job because of insufficiently carrying out the president's wishes on these matters, it is hard to imagine that there would be another attorney general who would be more fiercely and personally loyal to Donald Trump than Pam Bondi. We see now, as you heard Rachel report, that Todd Blanche, the current Deputy Attorney General, will now be the acting Attorney General. Now, Blanche is somebody who, of course, is the president's former personal defense attorney, has shown quite a bit of loyalty, but it's unclear what he would be able to carry out that Pam Bondi has not been able to carry out in terms of these politically charged cases against the president's enemies.
And on that note, let's bring in Chief Justice Correspondent Pierre Thomas. Pierre, what does this mean for the Justice Department now?
Well, let me just say this, Diane, from the outset. Having covered that building now going on 25 plus years, there has never been an Attorney General from my time of covering as close to a president as Pam Bondi was to President Trump. If you go outside of the Justice Department, you'll see a huge sign with President Trump's likeness, his photograph draped over the DOJ. So, as John put it, there is no question about loyalty. The execution of some of these cases against the former FBI Director James Comey, the execution of the case against New York Attorney General Letitia James, both, have failed to result in any kind of meaningful prosecution. They're both still being litigated. But again, the Epstein files and how that has unfolded with some of the missteps, according to her critics, by Pam Bondi, obviously played a key role. This notion of her being removed has been out there from time to time, but she has a great personal relationship as far as we know with the president. But clearly, in terms of the things that he wanted to have happen that were critical to him, they did not happen. In terms of DOJ, Todd Blanche, the acting attorney general, is a person who has, played a key role in the DAG position, Deputy Attorney General. They essentially run the building on a day-to-day basis in terms of major cases. So there will be a relatively smooth transition in that regard. But there are major issues that the Justice Department has to confront, and now there will be for Todd Blanche to deal with, as well as the politics.
So, John, what's Bondi's legacy as Attorney General? She wasn't there for an incredibly long period of time, but she did make lots of changes while she was.
She sure did. I think that the symbolic legacy is exactly what Pierre just mentioned, that seeing that big image of Donald Trump draped over the building, seeing Donald Trump go and visit the Justice Department, something you really don't see presidents do, except possibly in a very rare ceremonial case. But Donald Trump made it very clear that he wanted a Justice Department that would be his Justice Department, his essentially personal law firm. And Pam Bondi did a lot to make that happen. They systematically purged prosecutors throughout the Justice Department that had any role in any of the previous cases to prosecuting Donald Trump, any of the special counsel operations, all of those people gone. Really senior people, junior people, the FBI purged of anybody involved in those cases, or anybody that had any whiff of disloyalty or anything but total loyalty to the President of the United States. So Pam Bondi does have quite a legacy in just a year in office as somebody who made that Justice Department, pivoted it in a political way to make it lockstep in line with the desires of the President of the United States and the White House.
And Rachel, how is Blanche reacting to this?
Well, we just heard from Todd Blanche just moments ago. He thanks President Trump for the opportunity and for the trust to serve as acting attorney general. In a statement, he also thanks Pam Bondi for leading the department with what he calls strength and conviction, Diane. But still, there are big questions about whether or not Blanche stays in this role. If he does, he would, of course, have to be confirmed by the Senate. And he is arguably even embroiled in a lot of the controversy surrounding the Epstein files. Remember, Blanche, who once served as the president's personal attorney, also traveled to meet with Epstein's co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell for hours behind closed doors as well. So he would certainly face a lot of questions from lawmakers on both sides about that. Yeah. Diane.
Rachel Scott, Jonathan Karl, Pierre Thomas, thank you again. Pam Bondi is now out as U.S. Attorney General. Todd Blanche is now the acting U.S. Attorney General. Our coverage continues on ABC News Live and abcnews.com. And now we'll return to your regular programming. Of course, we'll have a full wrap-up on World News Tonight. I am Diane Macedo. Have a great rest of the day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
And we have breaking news. President Trump has ousted Pam Bondi from her position as Attorney General of the United States. Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, will now become the interim Attorney General. The president and Bondi were seen seated together yesterday inside the Supreme Court chamber for oral arguments in the birthright citizenship case, with the official White House X account posting this photo of the two of them speaking together outside of the court. Let's bring in our team coverage now. We're going to start with our Chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl. So, John, first just talk to us about why now, because we had been learning from sources that President Trump's frustration with Bondi had been building for months.
Who the president has actually quite a close relationship with, somebody who has been unflinchingly loyal to him in all things. So there was some reluctance to fire her, personal reluctance from the president. The frustration from Donald Trump's view here was really that in his mind, the Justice Department under Pam Bondi had not been aggressive enough in getting in doing what he talked about during his campaign, which is getting retribution against his political enemies. He has a long list of people that he thinks did him wrong, that he thinks should face criminal prosecution. Now, Pam Bondi's Justice Department did go after some of those people. Letitia James, who, of course, the New York Attorney General who brought the case against the Trump Organization. Jim Comey, who Donald Trump sees as somebody who betrayed him, his former FBI director, and even Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman. No indictments were ever issued against Jerome Powell, but they did open up an investigation into the Fed under Bondi's leadership. But to Trump, that wasn't enough. He wanted to see much more than that. And of course, those indictments of James and Comey were thrown out. Most legal analysts will tell you, because they were simply very, very weak indictments on the flimsiest of evidence. But Trump wants an all-out go and get the people that tried to get me and bring them down. And in his mind, Bondi hadn't done enough of that. There was also among the president's senior advisors a lot of frustration with the handling of the Epstein files and the way Bondi handled that, specifically really the public relations surrounding all of it. And one of the things that did not sit well was her most recent testimony on Capitol Hill, where Bondi was very aggressive in attacking the Democrats on the committee, but it was not seen as an effective defense of how they've handled the Epstein files. So, that's where it stands now. It wasn't that she was disloyal. You see in the statement that he reiterates that he loves Pam Bondi. She's going to get a great job. I wouldn't be surprised if he's going to, whatever that job is, something that he helps her get. But he wanted somebody that was going to be more effective in being his personal attorney, not just the Attorney General of the United States.
Well, I want to bring in our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, into this conversation. You just heard Jon Karl lay out how unflinchingly loyal Pam Bondi was. So if you install a new leader, what further changes will there be to the Justice Department, given how transformational she already was to the DOJ?
Well, that's unclear in this regard, in the sense that there was nothing that the president asked Pam Bondi to do, as far as we can see publicly, that she did not try to do. Remember, just a few months ago, he tweeted on a weekend that he wanted something done about former FBI Director James Comey, and he wanted something done about New York Attorney General Letitia James, and they were both indicted within a week or so of those remarks on social media. But the execution, there's this thing called the court system that matters have to work their way through. And in this case, a couple of judges ruled that these cases were not brought in a way that was proper and basically threw them out. So they're both being litigated. DOJ remains committed to pursuing them, but clearly that did not turn out the way the president had anticipated. Also, the whole handling of the Epstein files, which President Trump for the longest time was saying make it go away, was not that relevant, but ended up having to be something that DOJ was forced to release after unanimous, pretty much overwhelming action in both the House and the Senate on Capitol Hill. But as far as DOJ, Todd Blanche, the acting Attorney General right now, who had recently been the Deputy Attorney General, is a person who has been involved in the day-to-day of every aspect of this administration, the administration of justice since the administration came back into power. He will now be responsible for making the final decisions on all matters DOJ. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Clearly, this is a job it seems that he would want to have on a permanent basis. He was given it on an interim basis. We'll have to see who the president wants to nominate to do the job full time.
And ABC News Justice reporter Alex Mallon, just bouncing off of what Pierre said. I mean, Todd Blanche is someone who has also been staunchly, fiercely loyal to the president, also acted as a personal lawyer to the president. Do you think Trump is going to make him the permanent attorney general? How long can he be the acting one for?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely demonstrated his loyalty. One of his favorite anecdotes he likes to share is that when he was at a big law firm called Cadwalader, while he was out of office, he wanted to represent President Trump, and the firm told him he was not allowed to. So he left in order to join Trump's legal team and lead Trump's legal team and basically defend him in the two cases that were brought by former special counsel Jack Smith and New York Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg that really established his bona fides with the Trump's inner circle, basically saying that he was willing to reject this big elite law firm and say, I will join your team instead. And he's brought that over to him with the Justice Department. He's made it clear in multiple public remarks saying that he believes that President Trump was unfairly targeted, that his job was to root out weaponization, in their words, at this department. He said at CPAC, an extraordinary appearance, just the idea of a top DOJ official attending CPAC, and bragged last week that he has ousted and removed over 200 people who were just tied in some way to investigations into President Trump. Todd Blanche has definitely sought to demonstrate over and over, in the same way that Pam Bondi did, his personal loyalty to the president and his inner circle. He's also represented other people close to President Trump. So he's already really demonstrated that loyalty. But as John, Carl, and Pierre just raised, is that going to suffice in how he actually performs his job? This could be seen as something of a tryout period for him. And the stakes couldn't be higher. He has to demonstrate that he can do more than Pam Bondi was able to in order to target President Trump's enemies and bring the DOJ under further direct control of this White House.
Well, Alex Mallon, John Carl, Pierre Thomas, thanks to you all. We'll have much more later in the program. And President Trump says the war with Iran is nearing completion, but not before 2 or 3 more weeks of bombing. Trump is giving his first nationwide address since the start of the war nearly 5 weeks ago. He boasted about the military progress, saying that Iran's Navy and Army are gone and that most of the regime is dead. But the president is not saying when the operation will end. And the war is meantime sending gas prices soaring across the country. According to Gas Buddy, the average price of a regular gallon of gas has soared to $4.08 a gallon. Diesel prices skyrocketing to $5.46 per gallon. Our Andrew Dimbert joins me now for more. So, Andrew, we saw oil prices starting to go up as the president wrapped up that speech last night. Clearly, markets were hoping for more clarity of an off-ramp to this war. They did not get that. So tell us, where do the markets go from here?
Yeah, well, Iran's blockade continues to pummel the oil and gas market. As you mentioned, gas here in the United States going for over $4 a gallon nationwide, and it's really having ripple effects on global economies as well. Here in the United States, Wall Street taking a beating. All three indexes in the red today. They had some heavy losses early in the morning before recouping some of those, but the losses do continue. And we're also seeing crude prices at their highest elevated levels since 2022. So these are the highest levels we've seen in some 4 years. And today alone, crude spiking some 11%, trading at last check at around $110 a barrel. This all comes as now Iran and Oman are said to be drafting protocol to monitor activity in the Strait of Hormuz. Selena possibly hinting that the strait could be reopened in a very limited capacity. But again, we are still seeing oil prices surge.
And the UK is also set to host talks with dozens of other countries in hopes of getting the situation under control. What do we expect to come out of that?
Well, one of the major headlines from that meeting is that the U.S. is not going to be involved, but some of our major allies will be. You mentioned there the U.K., also Canada, France, and others are participating. They say the ultimate goal of these meetings is to reopen the Strait of Hormuz in its entirety, but through diplomacy and not military action. This as ships in the region are reportedly still being struck. Meanwhile, OPEC Plus, a group of about 12 oil-rich nations, says that it's going to be increasing oil output to try and ease the market. But many experts that we have spoken to over the past few weeks have said anything short of reopening the strait in its entirety, and we can continue to see the volatility in this market. Those experts also say, by the way, even if the strait were to be reopened, it could take months before we start to see prices stabilize. Selena.
Andrew Dimbert, thank you for breaking all of that down. And a historic moment for humanity. 4 astronauts orbiting Earth right now, on track to become the first crewed lunar voyage since 1972. America watching in awe as Artemis II lifted off the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center yesterday, officially embarking on the 685,000-mile 10-day journey around the moon. Day 2 is now all about safety inspections, with the crew checking the capsule systems and making sure that everything is good to go. We're also anticipating the next critical moment of this mission to unfold today. That's when the spacecraft executes the trans-lunar injection burn. That's a maneuver that slingshots the crew on an irreversible path to the moon. Our ABC News' Rena Roy has all the details.
3, 2, 1, booster ignition.